Welcome to Vasily Arkhipov Day. This is John Steinbach, and program is being coordinated by the Hiroshima Nagasaki Peace Committee of the National Capital Area. You can visit our website at hiroshimapeacecommittee.net. We've been in existence for 41 years now, and we've done a lot of work, particularly around supporting radiation survivors. And that includes downwinders, that includes A-bomb survivors, victims of nuclear testing worldwide. And particularly every year we welcome delegations of A-bomb survivor Hibakusha to visit the East Coast, and we're still doing our work. And he was actually the flotilla commander, and he happened to be on one of the nuclear submarines actually a submarine that had nuclear torpedoes on board off the coast of Cuba. And the U.S. Navy was trying to force the submarine to come to the surface, and it was using depth charges. And some of these depth charges were getting very close. The ventilation system was compromised. The temperature was increasing. They were out of communication with the surface, and the directives at the time said if you are under attack and you're not in communication with the surface, you have to assume that World War III has started, and the orders were to release the nuclear torpedoes. Well, Arkhipov was an old timer. He was an old salt, and he remembered that back during World War II, that oftentimes surface ships would use depth charges to signal that they wanted the submarine to come to the surface. And he figured out that that was what was going on, and they actually weren't under attack. So the commander and the first officer both gave the order to launch the nuclear torpedoes, but Arkhipov kept his cool and countermanded that order. And had he not done that, had he not been coincidentally on the B-59 submarine, those nuclear torpedoes would have been released, and they almost certainly would have detonated and would have destroyed the U.S. fleet. And it's virtual certain that that would have resulted in World War III. So it was a very lucky thing that Arkhipov happened to be on the submarine, and that he had the wisdom to go against orders and single-handedly, literally single-handedly prevented World War III. And Arjun's going to talk about this more in depth about what we knew and what we didn't know and parallels to where we are today. So I'd like to, when I introduce the panelists, I'm going to introduce the entire panel, and then I'll introduce each one separately. But as we're talking today, I want us to be respectful. There are going to be a diversity of opinions about, whose fault it is and who to blame and what what we need to do. So I want to be respectful of everybody's voice, to include everybody's voice, and to focus on the issue of the fact that many analysts believe that we are closer to nuclear war today than any time since 1962 or 1983. And I want the panelists to focus on how the situation today is similar to what it was in 1962 and in 1983 and the Able Archer incident, which Patrick Mazza is going to talk about in detail. But more importantly, I want to talk about differences between 1962 and 1983 and 20 2022, because there are a number of very significant differences. Back then, it was during the Cold War, it was ideological differences. Today, it's really not overwhelmingly ideological differences. Russia is clearly a capitalist and neoliberal society. And in China is socialism with capitalist characteristics. So it's not so much ideological, and it's not a bipolar situation of the U.S. and the Soviet Union. Today we're talking about the emergence of a multipolar world, and we also have climate change. Back then, climate change was not well understood. Today, we understand that climate change is another existential threat, an existential threat to humanity. We're also dealing with the crisis of resource depletion, the end of cheap fossil fuels, if you will. And we're talking about a world with growing inequality. And we're talking about a global economy that appears to be on the edge of a major global recession. And I would argue that all of these aspects of the current situation, all of them together work to lower the threshold to nuclear war. In other words, making nuclear war more likely. And then to add to that, we no longer have the ABM Treaty, which was abrogated by the second George Bush administration. That was considered by many experts to be the bedrock of all of the arms control agreements. We no longer have the INF, the Intermediate Nuclear Forces Agreement. We no longer have the Open Skies Agreement that permitted each other to fly over and to monitor what's going on. So the fact that we have all of these crises synergistically working against us, all of them lowering the threshold to nuclear war, and then we have the match, if you will. And the match is the current conflict in Ukraine. And this is bringing the world closer and closer and closer to a major shooting war directly involving the U.S. and NATO and Russia. So these are the things I want to talk about, we want to talk about today. And as we look back and look at how close the world has come to nuclear war, starting in the 1950s, and culminating with where we are today. And then I want us to talk a little bit about, what we need to do, where we need to go. But in order to do that, we need to understand where we were and where we are, and then talk about where we need to go. So each of the panelists is going to speak 15 to 20 minutes, and then we are going to open up the program for a brief discussion. So I wanted to look and to see, did I see that Dan Ellsberg, my old friend Dan Ellsberg, is on the program? And Dan, can you unmute and say hello to everybody? So Dan is not doing that. So I'm going to get started, but we're going to call on him if he's still here to say a few words. So first, I'd like to introduce Patrick Mazza. Patrick is an activist from Cascadia, the Pacific Northwest. He has spent many years particularly working on the issue of climate disruption, which is one of the existential threats to humanity that I talked about. But most recently, he has written a series of articles about the Able Archer crisis in 1983 and how the world came very close to nuclear war at that point. So I'd like to ask Patrick to talk a little bit about that situation and his thoughts about the current situation. So, Patrick, if you'll speak for about 15 or 20 minutes.
Very good. Thank you for having me. This for the first time in many years, the threat of nuclear war has burst into public awareness. Many proclaim we're at a pinnacle of danger not seen since 1962 and the Cuban Missile Crisis, when the US and USSR faced off over Soviet nuclear missiles in Cuba. That was a moment of maximum danger. But contrary to what Joe Biden recently stated, we have not faced the prospect of Armageddon since Kennedy and the Cuban Missile Crisis. There was another moment of peril in 1983 that is far less known. Daniel Ellsberg, hi Daniel if you're around, who is a defense analyst, advised the White House during the Cuban crisis, says it may have been even more dangerous. That was Able Archer 1983, a NATO exercise that took place in the early days of November, mimicking escalation in nuclear war in response to a Soviet invasion of Western Europe. Able Archer was the tail end of a series of NATO exercises in which 19,000 troops were airlifted to Europe to simulate defense against the invasion. Able Archer went through steps from requests for release of nuclear weapons to their delivery. It included B-52s sent to Europe, planes loaded up with dummy nuclear bombs, and refueling exercises. In this respect, it is remarkably similar to a NATO nuclear war exercise now being conducted over Europe, Steadfast Noon, in which dozens of planes from 14 nations are conducting mock bombing runs, and the US is using dummy bombs to practice sharing nuclear weapons with NATO partners. It began October 17th and runs through the 30th. This comes as deliveries of the upgraded, more accurate B-61-12 bomb to Europe have been speeded up. This is the adjustable bomb that supposedly can be used as a low-yield tactical nuclear weapon. It can go from 0.3 kilotons up to 50. By comparison, Hiroshima was 15. Meanwhile, the Russians are conducting their own nuclear exercise, Thunder 2022, beginning yesterday and running through the 28th. It has already seen actual launch of missiles from land, sea, and air. The obvious contrast between now and 1983 is that though the US was conducting a proxy war against the Soviets in Afghanistan, it was on the fringes of the then USSR. The Ukraine war is in Europe, close to the Russian heartland, with fighting at a far greater level of intensity. Could we be at an even greater level of danger now? The key issue that joins the present moment with 1983 is how each side perceives the intentions of the other. The crucial lesson of Able Archer is that misperception and miscommunication can cause a fatal error leading to a full nuclear exchange, especially at a time of heated rhetoric. Let us first look at 1983, then contrast and compare it with the present. Though I participated in the nuclear freeze global uprising against nuclear weapons in the 1980s, I have, as John said, mostly focused on that slower moving apocalypse of climate disruption for many years. But seeing the momentum build toward potential global holocaust, I undertook in recent months to survey the best literature on the event. On this event I had heard about for many years, 1983's close call with nuclear war. Fortunately, recent years have seen the publication of several books that delve deeply into the crisis, what led up to it and its aftermath. 1983, Reagan, Arkhipov, and A World on the Brink by Taylor Downing. The Brink, President Reagan, and the Nuclear War Scare of 1983 by Mark Ambinder, and Able Archer, yeah, that's it. And Able Archer 83, The Secret NATO Exercise That Almost Triggered Nuclear War by Nate Jones. The latter contains many formerly secret documents wrested from the archives. From these, I wrote a three-part series for my blog, theraven.substack.com. I will briefly summarize what I learned. First, it is key to know that then Soviet leader Yuri Andropov genuinely believed the US planned a nuclear first strike on the USSR. Ronald Reagan's white-hot rhetoric fueled that perception. When Reagan became president, he proclaimed the end of détente and was to label the Soviet Union the evil empire and call for its system to be left on the ash heap of history. In response, Arkhipov, still KGB chief, in 1981 ordered Ryan, the Russian acronym for nuclear missile strike. Soviet intelligence across the world was instructed to track hundreds of first strike preparation indicators, from movements of military forces and political leaders to blood drives. Operatives responsive to their superiors tended to produce information that confirmed their fears. Andropov's anxieties were grounded in what the Soviets had learned during their own nuclear exercises. It is the most powerful argument for entirely ridding the world of nuclear weapons. In a nuclear war, the side that strikes first has overwhelming advantage. It can decapitate the enemy's leadership and command and control systems, prospectively eliminating the ability to order a response, even as nuclear forces with which a counterstrike could be launched or destroyed. Heightening the fears of Soviet leaders were plans to place cruise and Pershing II missiles in Europe, which the Soviets believed could reach Moscow in a few minutes and accomplish a decapitation strike. This has come back today with Russian leaders expressing concerns over NATO missiles placed in Ukraine, even closer to the Russian capital. Reagan's announcement of the Star Wars defense program in March '83, 2 weeks after he made the Evil Empire speech, heightened Soviet worries. They believed this would make response to a first strike more difficult. The US was doing nothing to reduce Soviet fears with exercises near their borders. A later declassified National Security Administration history said these actions were calculated to induce paranoia, and they did. They included an August 1981 naval exercise in the Arctic north of the Kola Peninsula, and again, an April 1983 exercise close to Kamchatka. At that point, a plane from one of the carriers overflew a Soviet training base. They were conducting all kinds of flights around the border, and this got Yuri Andropov and the leadership totally alarmed. Andropov ordered shoot to kill for any plane that crossed the Soviet airspace. And what happened with KL-007 was mistaken for a spy plane and was shot down, reducing relations to maybe the lowest point of the Cold War. This was all coming as Able Archer was getting closer. There's other stuff happening. The Marine barracks in Lebanon had been bombed, and that led to a global alert at US military bases. The US invasion of Grenada happened. A country was a British Commonwealth country. There was an increased level of encrypted traffic between the US and UK. Meanwhile, revised NATO command and control procedures were another prospective sign the West was ramping up to war. The Soviets also worried that they'd always thought that if there was a surprise attack, it would come during a national holiday, and early November was the celebration of the Bolshevik Revolution in 1917. So they took a range of steps to prepare, including increased surveillance flights, grounding all their other aircraft, putting their fighters on strip alert, just running on the airstrips ready to take off, arming their bombers in East Germany with nuclear weapons ready to take off. Air defense radars were running continually. Submarines were out at sea. Half their mobile missile launchers were dispersed from their bases, while the usual portion was usually 10%. In another one of those situations, similar to that of Vasily Arkhipov, where one man's actions may have saved the world, Lieutenant General Leonard Perutz, who ran the US Air Force intelligence operation in Europe, picked up on many of these signs. But Perutz, who could not believe the Soviets were contemplating a strike, decided on gut instinct to do nothing. Writes Jones, had Perutz mirrored the Soviets and escalated the situation, the war scare could conceivably have become a war. A later intelligence review found his decision was made in ignorance, but fortuitous, was made in ignorance was fortuitous if ill-informed. On November 9th, Andropov waited in the hospital room where he was being treated. He was soon to die. A military aide held the briefcase containing the launch codes. The General Staff Chief Nikolai Ogarkov was in the Central Command bunker, authorized to launch if Andropov was killed. But the night passed and the sun rose to a world that was still there. How close did we come? It took years to fully realize the danger. Some call it the greatest intelligence failure in US history. The CIA and other officials thought the Soviets were exaggerating their fears to undermine US missile placements in Europe. It took until 1990 for a full review to be done by the President's Foreign Intelligence Advisory Board. To quote the board, Able Archer 83 may have inadvertently placed our relations with the Soviet Union on a hair trigger. There is little doubt in our mind that the Soviets were genuinely worried. It appears that at least some Soviet forces were prepared to preempt or counterattack a NATO strike launched under the cover of Able Archer. That is what draws the contrast most sharply between Able Archer and the Cuban crisis. In 1962, each side were aware they were in a crisis. In 1983, one side was preparing for war while the other side was oblivious. Today comes closer to Cuba in that each side is acutely tuned to the fact of crisis, but it has similarities to Able Archer in that each side is less than clear on the intentions of the other. US and Western leaders are asserting a desperate Russia could use nuclear weapons in Ukraine as a last resort and warning of a devastating response. Meanwhile, Russian leaders raise fears about a false flag event in Ukraine with radioactive dirty bombs and say Western countries may be colluding with Ukraine. Russian media currents buzz with concerns of something worse, including use of an actual nuclear weapon. At the same time, first strike fears are being raised. A Russian security journal on Monday published a piece, "The US has shown its readiness to launch a nuclear strike on Russia." It posits that US missile submarines operating close to Russia could conduct a successful first strike that would leave the nation unable to mount a significant response. Each side may be raising the rhetorical heat for propaganda purposes, as the CIA believed the Russians were doing in 1983. But it is a mistake to dismiss the possibility that statements may reflect real fears that could become self-fulfilling prophecies, particularly at a time when the Ukraine war seems to be in a pattern of tit-for-tat escalation. Consider what would happen if an early warning system gave a false reading that the other side had launched missiles. That occurred with the US system on November 9, 1979, when a war game program mistakenly loaded into the NORAD computer indicated 1,400 missiles incoming, triggering a full nuclear alert. Or on June 3rd, 1980, when a failed 46-cent computer chip set off another false alert. These errors were fortunately caught in time. We have to ask what would have happened if another of those Russians described as the man who saved the world, Stanislav Petrov, had not been in command at the Soviet Missile Command Center when on September 27, 1983, a new satellite system indicated 5 US missile launches. He had worked on the system and thought it was a faulty reading, and later, as it later proved to be. So Petrov decided not to report it to higher command. Who knows how a fearful Soviet leadership would have responded in the hair trigger environment in the wake of KL 007, and even as NATO fall exercises leading up to Able Archer were beginning to ramp up. So to answer the question of how close we are to nuclear war, the most honest answer is we don't know. But the danger is clearly escalated. And the longer the war goes on, the greater the risk these scenarios may become reality. Can we stop this runaway train before it derails? Well, in the wake of Able Archer, it took years to fully realize, but Ronald Reagan actually realized pretty quickly. He was disturbed to realize his own rhetoric had come close to spurring an attack. And he toned down his rhetoric and began to open up communications with the Soviets. And that led to the Intermediate Forces Treaty. And that eventually laid the groundwork for the START agreement signed in 1991 and renewed in 2021, which limits each side's deployed nuclear weapons to 1,550. The INF Treaty was unfortunately canceled, as John mentioned, but START was re-upped in 21 to run to 2026. Reportedly, there are back-channel discussions between the US and Russia going on. I think, as I think through this, trying to thread the needle, I think finding a way to resume START negotiations, even as the Ukraine war continues, is the key. The issues surrounding the war are, for the moment, intractable. It is crucial to place the transcendent issue of nuclear weapons on a separate track. How the Ukraine war is resolved has deep implications for global geopolitics. Whether we control nuclear weapons has implications for whether humanity survives at all. Having the two sides sit down in a forum where they can have open and frank discussions reduces uncertainty about intentions and eliminates potential misunderstandings, such as those that almost triggered war in 1983. Recent contacts between the defense leaders of Russia, the US, and the UK are a hopeful step in this direction. These discussions must put deep cuts in nuclear arsenals on the table, with a clear pathway toward what the nuclear nations promised when they signed the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty in 1968, the total abolition of nuclear weapons. The immediate goal should be to reduce deployed weapons from the current 50 to somewhere in the 300 to 500 range. That would still provide a deterrent. And the ICBM should go first. They're the use it or lose it. The bombers should go, leave them on the submarines, and then coming to an agreement on how close submarines operate to another coast is pretty important, because that's first strike possibility as well. And unlike START, the new treaty should eliminate the reserve arsenal. The US now has about 2,000 warheads in bunkers. The biggest bunch is 20 miles west of me in Seattle at the Trident base. If START is not renegotiated, they could quickly be deployed on existing missiles and bombers. So we shouldn't have any delusions about whether this will happen, just on the good nature of our leaders. The military-industrial complex is going to perpetuate the current system as long as it can. It's going to take intense public pressure and movement building. The 1980s nuclear freeze movement set the stage for INF and START. Excuse me. That probably wouldn't have happened if there hadn't been millions of people in the street. That's going to take something similar, again, to move to the same course of dramatic nuclear reductions and abolitions. We're nowhere near that now. It's our role as people concerned about the future and that of our children to build that movement. In reality, I believe we need a global survival movement that addresses the existential crises facing us, from climate disruption to nuclear war. It may seem unrealistic to consider such ambitious goals in the midst of the Ukraine war and conflicts between the US and Russia. But to quote I.F. Stone's classic phrase, it is crackpot realism to believe that we can keep nuclear weapons without them eventually being used. The imperatives of use it or lose it and the first strike advantage make that clear. I recently interviewed a former US Navy submarine captain, Tom Rogers, who handled nuclear weapons throughout his time on submarines and now works for their abolition as part of the Ground Zero Center. Tom has been arrested blocking the gate at the Trident nuclear missile base at Bangor, Washington, at least 10 times. Tom told me, it's only a matter of time until by miscalculation or accident a nuclear weapon gets used. Because of the way the strategy is written, you don't just shoot one nuclear weapon. You don't just see 3 coming over the horizon, you see 3,000. The only way to prevent that carnage is to get rid of them. That should be our call to mobilize, to end nuclear weapons before they end us. As steep a climb as it is, we really have no other choice if we value human survival. Thank you for listening.
Now, we don't know. That was the key words. We don't know how close we are. We just know that the situation is acute, and it's going to take a mass mobilization to to turn the tide, and I think it's going to need to be global, and I think that inevitably it is going to be led by the rest of the world, just as it was back in the 60s and 70s and 80s, and as we see it today with the Treaty on the Prohibition of Nuclear Weapons, and we look at which nations have signed that treaty, and it's very similar to the old non-aligned movement back in the day. Um, so the next, and for the record, back when the USS Ohio homeported, I was arrested at the gates, at the Trident gates, the very first blockade. So that's another story. Uh, so the next speaker is an old friend of mine, Jackie Cabazzo. Jackie and I have worked together I would say at least since 1990, perhaps even a little bit earlier. She was along with many others, was a founding member of the Abolition 2000 movement. She probably knows as much or more than anyone about the environment, except for perhaps Arjun, the environmental effects of the nuclear weapons production complex. She's led a number of lawsuits against the complex. She's just been an outstanding leader in the global disarmament movement. And she is the North American coordinator of Mayors for Peace. And so I'd like to ask Jackie to give her reflections on the current situation. So, Jackie, welcome.
Thank you very much, John, and thanks to the Hiroshima Nagasaki Committee. And I noticed that I think 3 of you who are on this call were on an earlier Zoom call that I did a presentation today. And this is not the same talk, but you will probably hear a few of the same quotes, so I apologize for that. So in the 1980s, the palpable fear of a nuclear war between the US and the Soviet Union was at the top of most people's minds in the US and around the world. Yet following the end of the Cold War, nuclear weapons fell off the public's radar screen. It was almost as if the planet itself breathed a huge sigh of relief. People around the world hoped and believed that they had escaped a nuclear holocaust and largely put nuclear weapons out of their minds. Most people believed that the threat of nuclear war had ended, but it hadn't. Deeply embedded in the US military-industrial complex, military planners and scientists at the nuclear weapons labs conjured up new justifications to sustain the nuclear weapons enterprise. Following the collapse of the Soviet Union in 1991, Colin Powell, then chair of the US Joint Chiefs of Staff, declared, quote, "We no longer have the luxury of having a specific threat to plan for. What we plan for is that we're a superpower. We are the major player on the world stage with responsibilities and interests around the world," end quote. In fact, US national security policy has been remarkably consistent in the post-World War II and post-Cold War eras, despite dramatically changed geopolitical conditions and very different presidential styles. Deterrence, the threatened use of nuclear weapons, has been reaffirmed as the cornerstone of US national security by every president, Republican or Democrat, including Obama, since 1945, when President Harry Truman, a Democrat, oversaw the atomic bombings of Hiroshima and Nagasaki. Russia and other would-be superpowers have increasingly modeled their own national security policies, as well as their economies, on the US model. Nuclear weapons, in fact, are already being used by Russia, the US, and NATO to provide top cover for their conventional military operations. In February of last year, Admiral Charles Richard, head of US Strategic Command, in charge of nuclear war planning, wrote, quote, "We must acknowledge the foundational nature of our nation's strategic nuclear forces as they create the maneuver space for us to project conventional military power strategically," end quote. Well, clearly we're seeing this concept being played out by Russia in the Ukraine. Richard also warned, quote, "There's a real possibility that a regional crisis with Russia or China could escalate quickly to a conflict involving nuclear weapons if they perceived a conventional loss would threaten the regime or state," end quote. We are living in a time of extraordinary nuclear dangers. All of the nuclear armed states are modernizing their nuclear arsenals. With Russia's illegal war of aggression in Ukraine, which could eventually draw the militaries of the US, its NATO allies, and Russia into direct conflict, exacerbated by Russia's repeated threats to use nuclear weapons, the specter of war has risen to its highest level since, well, take your choice, the 1962 Cuban Missile Crisis or the 1983 Able Archer Crisis. Other festering nuclear flashpoints include Taiwan, the Korean Peninsula, South Asia, and the Middle East. The scale of war games by nuclear-armed states and their allies, including nuclear drills, are increasing. Ongoing missile tests and frequent close encounters between military forces of nuclear-armed states exacerbate nuclear dangers. While our nuclear worries have mainly been focused on Russia of late, on October 9th, North Korea fired 2 ballistic missiles, the 7th such launch since September 25th. According to North Korea's state news agency, KCNA, the recent flurry of missile tests was designed to simulate showering South Korea with tactical nuclear weapons as a warning in response to large-scale Navy drills by South Korean and US forces. KCNA reported that the various tests simulated targeting military command facilities, striking main ports, and neutralizing airports in the south to deliver a strong message of war deterrence. The North Korean Ministry of Defense also warned that the US recent deployment of the aircraft carrier Ronald Reagan near the Korean Peninsula is causing a, quote, considerably huge negative splash, end quote, in regional security, and defended its recent missile tests as a, quote, righteous reaction, end quote, to intimidating military drills between its rivals. Just yesterday, South Korea, Japan, and the US warned North Korea that there would be a, quote, unparalleled response if it conducted a 7th nuclear test. Today, it's being reported that the US has accelerated the fielding of the upgraded B-6112 airdrop gravity bomb to bases in Russia. This had been originally slated for next spring, but is now planned for December. When asked for comment, the Pentagon spokesman responded that, quote, while we aren't going to discuss details of our nuclear arsenal, modernization of US B-61 nuclear weapons has been underway for years, and plans to safely and responsibly swap out older weapons for the upgraded B-6112 versions is part of a long-planned and scheduled modernization effort. It is in no way linked to current events in Ukraine and was not sped up in any way, end quote. Well, I could imagine that Russia doesn't see it that way. The Russian leadership's latest nuclear threats have raised public anxiety at the possibility of nuclear war. But in reality, we've been living under the shadow of the mushroom cloud continuously since 1945. In 1982, at the height of the Cold War, Swedish Prime Minister Olof Palme's Independent Commission on Disarmament and Security Issues published a report which introduced the concept of common security, the notion that nations and peoples can only feel safe when their counterparts feel safe. To mark the 40th anniversary of this landmark report, the Olof Palme International Center, International Peace Bureau, and International Trade Union Confederation issued a new report titled Common Security 2022 for Our Shared Future. It begins, the world, quote, the world stands at a crossroads, faced with a choice between an existence based on confrontation and aggression, or one to be rooted in a transformative peace agenda and common security. In 2022, humanity faces the existential threats of nuclear war, climate change, and pandemics. This is compounded by a toxic mix of inequality, extremism, nationalism, gender violence, and shrinking democratic space. How humanity responds to these threats will decide our very survival. It is against this backdrop that the first meeting of states parties to the Treaty on the Prohibition of Nuclear Weapons, or TPNW, and the 10th Review Conference of the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty, or NPT, took place this summer. The NPT represents the only binding commitment in a multilateral treaty to the goal of disarmament by the 5 original nuclear armed states, the US, UK, USSR and its successor Russia, France, and China. In Article 6, All states, including the nuclear armed states, pledged, quote, to pursue negotiations in good faith on effective measures relating to cessation of the nuclear arms race at an early date and to nuclear disarmament, end quote. In Articles 1 and 2, non-nuclear armed states pledged not to acquire nuclear weapons or transfer them to other states. As an incentive not to acquire nuclear weapons, in Article 4, the non-nuclear armed states were promised a, quote, inalienable right, end quote, to, quote, peaceful, end quote, nuclear technology and assistance with research, production, and use of nuclear energy for peaceful purposes, quote, without discrimination. The NPT was signed in 1968 and entered into force in 1970. Its initial duration was 25 years. In 1995, the treaty was extended indefinitely, with a review conference to be held every 5 years. Nearly every country in the world, 191 in all, is a party to the NPT with 4 exceptions: India, Israel, and Pakistan, all nuclear armed states, and South Sudan. North Korea, now nuclear armed, withdrew in 2003, but its withdrawal is not recognized by the NPT states parties. The NPT's disarmament obligations, enshrined in the preamble in Article 6, have been reiterated and reinforced by agreements made in connection with the 1995 extension decision, the 2000 and 2010 review conferences, and the International Court of Justice's 1996 advisory opinion, which provided the authoritative interpretation of Article 6. The court found unanimously, quote, there exists an obligation to pursue in good faith and bring to a conclusion negotiation leading to nuclear disarmament in all its aspects under strict and effective international control, end quote. Consensus broke down in the 2005 and 2015 NPT review conferences, and they were unable to produce final outcome documents due to the failure of the nuclear armed states to make good on their disarmament obligations. The failure of the 2015 review conference also provided impetus for negotiation of the Treaty on the Prohibition of Nuclear Weapons at UN headquarters in New York in 2017. The treaty entered into force on January 22nd, 2021. Framed in terms of deep concern about the catastrophic humanitarian consequences that would result from any nuclear weapons use, the TPNW prohibits states parties from developing, testing, producing, manufacturing, transferring, possessing, stockpiling, using, or threatening to use nuclear weapons, or allowing nuclear weapons to be stationed on their territory, and prohibits them from assisting, encouraging, or inducing anyone to engage in any of these activities. The TPNW also requires state parties to provide assistance to victims of nuclear use or testing under its jurisdiction, and to undertake environmental remediation of areas under its jurisdiction contaminated by testing or use of nuclear weapons. The first meeting of TPNW states parties took place in Vienna, Austria, in June of this year, where they adopted the Vienna Declaration and a 50-point Vienna Action Plan. There are currently 91 signatories and 68 states parties to the treaty. While all of them are non-nuclear armed states parties to the NPT, the TPNW is binding only on those states which have signed and ratified it. In the Vienna Declaration, states parties expressed their alarm and dismay at threats to use nuclear weapons and condemned unequivocally, quote, any and all nuclear threats, whether they be explicit or implicit and irrespective of the circumstances, end quote. Affirming that the TPNW is needed more than ever in these circumstances, the states parties resolved to, quote, move forward with its implementation with the aim of further stigmatizing and delegitimizing nuclear weapons and steadily building a robust global peremptory norm against them, end quote. They also reaffirmed the complementarity of the treaty with the NPT and undertook to continue to support the NPT and all measures that can effectively contribute to nuclear disarmament. While the states parties to the TPNW feel that negotiating the TPNW was a good faith effort to implement Article 6 of the NPT, the nuclear armed states parties to the NPT are hostile to the TPNW, asserting that it undermines the NPT. Since no nuclear armed state or state under a nuclear umbrella has joined the TPNW, it is not yet a disarmament treaty. I find it somewhat ironic that the only concrete obligation of states parties to the NPT can undertake at this point is victim assistance and environmental remediation resulting from nuclear use and testing that they were not responsible for. At the close of the month-long 10th NPT review conference on August 26th of this year, states parties meeting at the UN in New York were unable to agree on the text of a final document. While the proximate cause was Russia's refusal to accept language about its military occupation of the Zaporizhzhia nuclear power plant in Ukraine, it was clear that many governments were dissatisfied with the draft final document, feeling that it was weak and lacking benchmarks, timelines, and measurable goals for nuclear disarmament. While the nuclear armed states had apparently been willing to accept vague recommitments to previous obligations in the draft final document, they were not willing to commit to any concrete pathway to get there. In a draft document, the 4 other nuclear armed states must have known Russia would block. This can only be viewed as the epitome of bad faith during a 4-week festival of double standards, hypocrisy, and outright lying by the nuclear armed states. As Ambassador Kement said on behalf of Austria, quote, "We hope that the deeply unsatisfactory result of this review conference will serve as a wake-up call. Austria will not tire in our work to implement the NPT and the TPNW. We have no other choice given the existential dangers and risks of nuclear weapons," end quote. In 1946, Lewis Mumford wrote, quote, "You cannot talk like sane men around a peace table while the atomic bomb itself is ticking beneath it. Do not treat the atomic bomb as a weapon of offense. Do not treat it as an instrument of the police. Treat the bomb for what it is, the visible insanity of a civilization that has ceased to worship life and obey the laws of life," end quote. Sitting in the basement of the United Nations for 4 weeks, observing the MPT sessions that were open to civil society was literally like watching mad, mostly men, around what's supposed to be a peace table, now with the hydrogen bomb ticking beneath it. The failure of the 2022 NPT review conference due to the intransigence of the nuclear armed states in the face of new arms racing, the long-term viability of the NPT is being questioned by some. An aspect of this review conference deserving greater scrutiny was the hyperbolic promotion of so-called peaceful uses of nuclear technology by the International Atomic Energy Agency and most of the states parties, nuclear armed and nuclear weapons free. Article 4 of the NPT confers upon all states parties an inalienable right to peaceful nuclear technology. The draft final document, which was not adopted, states, quote, "The conference underlines that IAEA activities in the field of technical cooperation and nuclear applications contribute in an important way to meeting energy needs, improving human and animal health, combating poverty, protecting the environment, developing agriculture, managing the use of water resources, optimizing industrial processes, and preserving cultural heritage, thus helping to improve the quality of life and the well-being of the peoples of the world," end quote. In contrast to the lack of measures to advance nuclear disarmament going forward, the draft final document included a long list of specific activities to further promote and expand so-called peaceful uses of nuclear technology. Listening to the government statements and reading their working papers, one might be led to believe that nuclear energy will solve all of the world's problems. Yet most, if not all, nuclear technology is inherently dual use, meaning it has the potential to be weaponized. Against the background of ongoing proliferation concerns and palpable alarm about growing nuclear dangers at Zaporizhzhia, no one questioned the wisdom of re-legitimizing and reinvesting in so-called peaceful nuclear technology. An examination of this paradox is called for. The hard truth is that neither the NPT nor the TPNW can achieve disarmament for the foreseeable future, because it is clear that none of the nuclear armed states are willing to reimagine a global system based on common security rather than nuclear coercion, euphemistically called deterrence. We cannot leave our future survival to the national governments. Humanity must include all of us from all walks of life, wherever we live. As Mahatma Gandhi observed, quote, The moral to be legitimately drawn from the supreme tragedy of the bomb is that it will not be destroyed by counter bombs, even as violence cannot be by counter violence. Mankind has to get out of violence only through nonviolence. Hatred can be overcome only by love. Counter hatred only increases the surface as well as the depth of hatred, end quote. And he explained how social transformation will come from the bottom up. Quote, we have to make truth and nonviolence not matters for mere individual practice, but for practice by groups and communities and nations. Before general disarmament commences, some nation will have to dare to disarm herself and take large risks. The level of nonviolence in that nation, if that event happily comes to pass, will naturally have risen so high as to command universal respect. Her judgment will be unerring, her decisions firm. Her capacity for heroic self-sacrifice will be great, and she will want to live as much for other nations as for herself, end quote. It is important to recall that coming on the heels of the many civil rights movements, the anti-Vietnam War movement, the women's movement, the gay liberation movement, and the ecology movement, the massive anti-nuclear movement that arose in the 1980s was not single issue. As a strategy and necessity this time around, let us work together to understand the common causes of our multifaceted crises as we work to build the massive, multi-issue, multi-generational, multiracial, international, moral fusion movement we will need to overcome systemic violence, including the elimination of nuclear weapons, and build a peaceful, just, sustainable, and inclusive world. Tactically, I think we need to refocus our efforts at the local level in order to raise the visibility of nuclear risks to ordinary people and make them the subject of national discourse. Given the stakes, it is astonishing that nuclear weapons were barely mentioned during the 2020 presidential campaign. Going forward, we need to change that by working where we live to make nuclear weapons a local issue. Finally, I want to offer a cautionary note on our approach to the war economy. We need to always keep in mind that militarism and the military budget are about more than just military spending and guns versus butter. We also need to pay attention to the purposes and interests that militarism serve, and how perpetual war preparations underscore a culture of violence that runs from the top to the bottom of our society. I believe there are a few promising initiatives and campaigns that offer a useful way forward. These include first and foremost the Poor People's Campaign, a national call for moral revival, as well as Marriage for Peace and the Back from the Brink campaign. I hope there's time during Q&A for me to elaborate on these and some other local initiatives. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you, Jackie. That was a great presentation. So you quoted Lewis Mumford. So back in 1946 in the Saturday Review, he did a very important service to everyone. He wrote an article called "Gentlemen, You Are Mad," referring to pursuit of nuclear weapons, and I think that still is absolutely relevant today. I'd like to point out that our founder of the Hiroshima Peace Committee, Louise Franklin Ramirez, was a recipient of the Mumford Peace Award, and that there helping to make the presentation was Dan Ellsberg, who often tells a story about how Louise was responsible for his first arrest. So, Dan, I'm going to be calling on you after Arjun to make a few comments, and I'm also going to call. Jackie referred to nuclear victims and how the responsibility of the signatories to the ban review are to nuclear cleanup and nuclear victims, and so we have Dennis Nelson as well. So I'm going to call on Dennis to talk about the global hibakusha. Dennis is a downwinder from St. George. But first of all, I'm going to introduce Arjun. So Arjun is, many of you know, is an author of many books, principal author of Nuclear Wastelands. I'd also like to point out that early on, Arjun and Dan Ellsberg, somewhat independently of each other, came up with a list of nuclear threats. So we have the two authors of the initial nuclear threats, mostly made by the United States, with us today. So Arjun is, in addition to all of his academic achievements and movement achievements, is co-founder of the Hiroshima Nagasaki Peace Committee, which back in 1981 was the Hiroshima Nagasaki Study Group. And it was out of that study group that was led by Arjun that the Hiroshima Nagasaki Peace Committee emerged. So without further ado, I'd like Arjun to reflect on the situation today. So Arjun, it's yours.
Thank you. Well, I'm getting a little bit more credit than I deserve. I think Dan was first in compiling the nuclear threat lists. And I saw his list in an article somewhere. And I had been compiling, I hadn't published anything, but I had seen a different set of threats. And so that's how I think I first came in contact with Dan in the early 80s. Anyway, Dan was there first. And I'm so privileged to know him. Anyway, so I thank you, Jackie. As usual, I really agree with you. Thank you for that Mumford quote. I've read a lot of Mumford, but I had not come across that quote. And that kind of cues my talk. So I think I start with the point that the powers that be know what Patrick said. They know these, they know about the Cuban Missile Crisis, of course. They know about the 1983 events. They know about Petrov. They know about Vasily Arkhipov. They know about all, because, they've activated the nuclear threats and, Dan's observation that it's a use of nuclear weapons much as a gun pointing to somebody's head woke me up. That was in 1979. So I want to reflect on why we are still sitting at the edge of the nuclear precipice. So what Patrick said, Dan has been saying for many years, get rid of the land-based missiles. They're really a threat. You are making yourself a target by having them. If you want deterrence, get rid of them, all that. So why are we still here? I want to start where Jackie ended, is that we are in the heart of an extremely violent system whose most recent manifestations started in 1492, one date, and around the latter part of the 18th century, another date, and I'll explain that. But first, let me give you a few other dates that are important to the nuclear enterprise that are not much remarked on. October 9th, 1941 was when Vannevar Bush briefed President Roosevelt. And that's what really triggered the big project to build the bomb. Before that, there was the Uranium Committee. Vannevar Bush, as the guy in charge of weapons in the White House, wasn't that much interested. He wanted to bring academic physics and science in the service of this war. And this is before the US was in the war. Of course, there was a Lend-Lease program and all that. So he was building up the weapons capacity. And when the British committee came and said, yeah, we can do this, we can enrich enough uranium and a gun-type bomb is possible. I don't remember how many kilograms they said, but it wasn't a very big number. He became convinced he could build it, and then he accepted, yeah, maybe we should beat Hitler to the punch. But he was determined that the Pentagon should not see academic physicists and engineers as eggheads who could produce something for the next war. He was interested only in weapons in this war, and he wanted to bring the sort of might of academic science, if you want to think about it that way, into the service of that goal. In addition, if you read his book, Arms, I think it's called Arms and Free Men or something like that, his memoir after the war, he clearly was determined that the United States should be top dog. And we know that, that ran through the bombings of Hiroshima and Nagasaki. But October 9th, 1941 was the spirit of the determination that we make the bomb in time and it works, then it should be used in the service of US being the top dog. And, that goes through history. Bush wasn't alone, of course. Grove said the same thing much later. So October, that was 2 months before Pearl Harbor. The other date, this group is very familiar with, set of dates, early December 1944, which is when the US found out that the Germans don't have a viable bomb project definitively. They had many indications before. And when Rotblat left Los Alamos and went back, I think, to Europe, England, and the project was accelerated. Now, you all know that, but it's very important, because if the original purpose of deterring Hitler and, being there first, if they had been true to that and stopped then, that was a time where the plutonium separation plant at Hanford had not yet been started. I think a reactor had been started up, but there were only minute quantities of plutonium that the people at Los Alamos were working with to determine its properties. Emilio Segre, you know all of that, and how we came by the implosion bomb design, or they came by the implosion bomb design at Los Alamos. But quantities of plutonium had not been separated at all, because the Hanford plutonium separation plant had not yet been. So this is, in a way, before the real industrial atomic age that enabled us, the world, to make weapons in quantity. This was before that. And Richard Feynman, very famous physicist, great physicist, quantum mechanics, Nobel Prize winner, he was there in Los Alamos when they were dancing after Hiroshima. And he was there, part of that kind of tailgating party there. And in 1980, he reflected, why were we dancing? He was very honest in this interview with BBC. Why were we dancing? While, Hiroshima had been kind of reduced to rubble. And he said basically that, the purpose of why he went there, he didn't really want to. He loved quantum mechanics better than making a bomb. And he went. And he said, the purpose of it was over. We knew that. But yet I stayed. This is a paraphrase, obviously. And what is not a paraphrase is he ended by saying, I wasn't thinking, okay? And this is one of the greatest physicists in the first half of the 20th century who made this very remarkable confession that he wasn't thinking, okay? And nobody in Los Alamos has said, well, if he wasn't thinking, were we thinking? No one has picked it up. Okay, early 1950s, before the bomb, the thermonuclear weapon was actually developed, one of the makers of the thermonuclear weapons, who was cautioning, I don't know if it was Oppenheimer or somebody else, said, this is a genocidal weapon. And we should pause before we do this. Maybe we should contact the Soviets. And then, of course, both developed the thermonuclear weapon. And Churchill made a speech about that in 1955 in Parliament, very famous speech. Basically, there's a famous quote, which I will read. But before that quote, he basically said that thermonuclear weapons have leveled the playing field. And in a way, now deterrence is better than it was before. That's also a paraphrase. Because the Soviet Union is a vast country and they have low population density. So regular bombs might not deter them. But the thermonuclear bomb is such a vast weapon that it has basically wiped out the difference between a densely populated island country like Britain or Western Europe, and the Soviet Union. So now, then he says, then it may well be that we shall, by a process of sublime irony, have reached a stage in this story here where safety will be the sturdy child of terror and survival the twin brother of annihilation. And that's the logic that led to the Cuban Missile Crisis. Now, everybody, in the Cuban Missile Crisis, the best face on it is Kennedy and Khrushchev realized it was a very bad situation, and they kind of stood up to their military establishment and made a deal. Good, all that is true. None of them knew about Arkhipov, of course, but in the 1990s, we knew about Arkhipov. Now we know about him. He's not very famous. And so I'm very grateful that John has begun the process, I hope, that will make him famous. And that we shall be justly grateful for what he did and reflect on him and how we can take inspiration for a world that will learn a lesson from him. But we haven't. Obviously, we haven't. The establishment knows about Arkhipov. The Cold War was over. People like Sam Nunn and establishment people, General Jones, I think it was, who was the head of the Strategic Air Command after he retired, said, let's take weapons off alert. We're sitting at the edge. This kind of survival twin brother of annihilation is not that great an idea. The Cold War is over. But that never happened. And my question is, why? They know what we know. Intellectually, if they read Dan's book and they read the analysis, get rid of the land-based missiles, take weapons off alert, no first use, it all makes perfect sense. It can only be that the hypothesis is that what they think of survival is not what we're talking about. They think of survival, first of all, and this is a hypothesis, open to debate. I'm doing this in honor of Vasily Arkhipov and letting you all hang out, that their idea of survival, like the slave owner's idea of freedom, centered in property, including property in other people, is exclusive. Their idea of survival is connected to domination, to exceptionalism, to being the top dog, to telling everybody. And then that's accompanied by an interesting, systematic, delusional idea that you are civilized, you are generous, you are not greedy, you're there for the good of Africans and Asians, and you're going to civilize them and Christianize the savages, whatever. So I want to point out two things. You all know about Rudyard Kipling, not one of my favorite people, before the Philippine War, urging the U.S. on, but could just as well have applied to India. He was unabashed imperialism, and he wrote this poem called "The White Man's Burden." And in this poem, he wrote about famine. And I just want to read that part. Take up the white man's burden, the savage wars of peace, fill full the mouth of famine and bid the sickness cease. And if you'll allow me to share my screen, what the British did in India in that period was, so this is kind of what Freud would have called projection. So you're actually creating famine and killing millions of people. And I want to show you something. Maybe it will share my screen, John, or whoever's managing the screen. Yeah.
It should work for you.
Yeah. Okay. I will share my screen. Oh, now I've got too many things open. Here. Can you see this? No, you cannot see this. Yeah. Can you see this now?
No.
Can you see this?
Yes.
This is a chart of grain trade, imports of grain into Britain. And I'll stop very soon after this. So this is the date when the Corn Laws were repealed. Marx wrote about that as a watershed event in capitalism. Before this, the feudals were in charge in Britain pretty much. Grain was restricted. They were making a lot of money by high-priced grain. This is when cheap grain for the workers became more important, and the Corn Laws were repealed. And this shows you how Britain was basically, this is kilograms per capita of grain when people were mostly eating wheat. And this is 440 pounds, this top line here, per person. That's more than a pound of wheat per person per day. This is grain. Now, where did this grain come from? it came from two places primarily. It came from the United States, where it was grown on conquered land, gotten, by people who had occupied it after genocide was committed, and the people who were there were wiped out. The other place it came from was India. And there was a famine every 2 years in India between 1860 and the early 20th century. And I want to show you pictures from just one of those famines in 1876, 1878, in the part of the country, mostly where I grew up. And these are pictures from Victorian Holocausts. So this is what Kipling was really writing about, and you think they're pictures from the trenches in 1945. They are not. They are pictures from the 1876, 1878 famine. The reason to show you this, normally I don't do this at all. I'm very reluctant to show these pictures because, there's a kind of, there's a kind of not a good side to showing those pictures. But I want to show them because there is a deep and ingrained delusion within the people who are running the system. What they think about freedom, what they think about democracy is not what Mandela thought about freedom, not what Gandhi thought about freedom, not what King thought about freedom. I have written about that in my book, Manifesto for Global Democracy. So I would suggest, that I agree with where Jackie ended. We say there are two existential crises, and that's very true. That there's a nuclear crisis and there's a climate crisis. But for more than half the people in the world, every day is an existential crisis. And that, it's an existential crisis literally for survival. And I learned this the hard way as somebody who grew up not lacking for a meal. And when I went to work in the villages in India and realized that my fancy PhD wasn't much use, and I asked myself, I didn't think that my doctorate in nuclear fusion was worth anything. And I asked myself the question, what is really worth knowing? What do you really know that's worth anything? And my immediate answer then was close to nothing. And so I had to ask the question, what is worth knowing? Who knows what is worth knowing? And I could see that the peasants around me, including peasant women, mostly had not even finished school. They knew a lot more in the existence sense than I did. I asked myself, the definition of knowledge really should be, what do you know of the connection between what's on your plate and what's in your pocket that enabled you to buy it? Now, what's on the peasant's plate and what they do for a living is generally transparent, especially to the poorest peasants, because it's very immediate. They know it, they know the land, they can feel it in their hands. They when they broadcast the seed, they know what's happening to it. And the second thing I will close with is this, that so we talk about progress. So there's this idea, it was very much in the center of Marxist thinking. And one reason he came up with many good ideas, but I don't think this was one of them, that there's a kind of a march of progress, the stages of history. So 1,000 years ago, if you had asked someone, how many generations can you see? How far out can you see? So your life may be brutal and short. You don't have vaccinations, if you can kind of go back and ask. We have vaccinations. Not everybody wants them. How far out can you see? And they would have said many generations. Of course, I have children. Many of them may die, but few will survive. And, my village will go on. But since the 50s, at least, since Churchill's speech, since the Cuban Missile Crisis, since Vasily Arkhipov, we have known that we can't really confidently see even 15 minutes out. So we don't have a very good definition of knowledge, in my opinion. We don't have a definition of knowledge that is in consonant with that quote, we have stopped loving, worshiping life or the forces of life. Thank you, Jackie. You might repeat that. I forgot it already. But we don't even have in my opinion, the fundamental science should be ecology, because it unites the observer and the observed in the process of survival and reproduction. But our paradigm of science is physics, which was founded in the time of Newton in many ways in the Royal Society. And Lewis Mumford wrote about this in The Pentagon of Power, and I'll end here, is that they were told as physicists, don't think about politics, do your job, do your science. And the physics-oriented science. It wasn't so in the United States in 1939, but Vannevar Bush, by 1941, he had brought academic physics into the service of the military and the bomb. Physics we regard as the paradigm of science, whereas I don't think it's actually an accurate epistemological view, just from a philosophical point of view, and certainly not a view that is in consonance with survival that we're talking about. So where we are is a system that is crumbling. It's a different talk, but its peak was in 1973. The Columbian age is over, and we have no positive model in the way we want to shape this. How are we going to, what's the process of grabbing the reins sufficiently to get rid of nuclear weapons? Not in the sense of political power, but in the sense of a process by which they can actually be dismantled or at least de-alerted. I don't have any good answers for you, but I would suggest that these three existential crises do go together, and I'm very glad that Jackie preceded me in making a better case than I have done, which is very scattered. But I did want to give you a little bit of a historical tour for somebody who was born when the British still occupied his country.
Thank you very much. Thank you, Arjun. You always provide insights to help us to understand what's going on. So you talked about the fact that the bomb has taken away our future, and we really can't see 15 minutes into the future. And Robert J. Lifton and Helen Caldicott both wrote about this idea of psychic numbing, and they focused on this issue that the threat is so great, the future has been taken away, and so therefore we're overwhelmed and we don't do anything. And I think that's something to reflect on. That the important thing is we need to understand what the threat is in order to organize and to confront the threat. Before we open it up to general discussion, I'd like to recognize Dan Ellsberg. Dan, you're there. If you can hear me, I see you on the screen. If you could say a few words, and then I'm going to ask Dennis Nelson to talk a little bit about the global victims of the bomb. So Dan, can you unmute yourself and say a few words for us?
Okay, thank you. Those are, we've just heard extraordinary presentations, I would say, extremely moving. I got the impression that Patrick and my old friend Jackie were reading a piece. Can I ask, I would very much like a link if you have any to that, and I'm sure other people would like that. Probably John can forward them to people.
Yes, I'll forward it to everybody.
And Arjun, I'm not sure whether yours was written or not. Like me.
Completely extemporaneous.
You had to talk
I had some
I would love to hear that too. Again, extraordinarily moving. Look,
I'll send you my bullet points.
I was tempted to tell some very nice nostalgic anecdotes because it's been mentioned about both John's long-term partner, Louise, and who did get arrested with me, or I got arrested with her the first time after my first arrest for the Pentagon Papers. But and for Arjun, but actually, let me just use the time to reflect on a couple of things we've heard here. You don't need me to tell you more history. And Patrick, I'm so glad that you focused on the 1983 case. We've been hearing in the 60th anniversary of the Cuban Missile Crisis every day that how dangerous that was. And of course, our president has told us this is the most dangerous time since 1962. And as you made clear, I would say, no, you and I know. Matter of fact, you mentioned, I take it you were mentioning this book. Wait a minute. Were you holding up this book earlier, The Brink? And
Yes,
then,
yes.
1983 is right. And I'm sure you know too, this book from the National Security Archive, Nathan Jones, extremely good. And both Cuba and 1983 have characteristics that are very, very relevant to our current predicament. And so let me just raise one thing first. In 1983, as you said, Patrick, not only the rhetoric of Ronald Reagan about the evil empire and we bomb in 15 minutes, something like that on a live microphone, but also lesser known actual exercises that they were making, exercising nuclear reconnaissance in various ways. Reconnaissance planes that were not only going alongside the then Soviet Union, but inside the air zones of the Soviet Union to scare them, to keep them on edge, to tense. And that Andropov, in his last year of life on a kidney dialysis machine, which no one has mentioned, but I have a feeling was not unrelated to his concern that the world, that he was about to be attacked and that he had to prepare something. Almost nobody, including even these excellent books, I'm not sure if anyone, has raised the question for 1983, given that Andropov had reason to fear, well, he had reason to fear Reagan, who he thought was crazy, by the way, and who a lot of people in the country thought were crazy. Reagan almost brought forth the nuclear freeze movement to a large extent, made it important, and brought 1 million people to Central Park to call for a bilateral nuclear weapons freeze, precisely because they were as worried as Andropov about the way Reagan was talking about nuclear weapons. And so, as you know, Andropov had the largest intelligence effort in history, so far as we know, Ryan, R-Y-A-N, or A-R-Y-N, for nuclear surprise attack, to tell him whether the US was on the verge of a surprise attack. And Abel Archer fed into that, came at the same time. Stanislav Petrov, false alarm on, I think it was September, the night of 26, 27, was right in that mood of fear of Andropov, that he was about to have a surprise attack, which is being raised right now, as we know. No one has asked, and why was Andropov going to do with that information? What good was it for him to know that we were about to attack? Whether it was tactical warning on the way, which is really pretty late to have any effect, or the kind of thing he was supposing. How many lights are on in the State Department at night? Are cars gathered together? He really wanted strategic warning before the missiles have launched. To what effect? Clearly, for the same reason we would do it if we were afraid we were about to be attacked. Because Russia for long has imitated us in sharing the delusion that to strike first preemptively is less bad than to strike second, even if it's horrible, even while you're quite recognizing that your preemptive first strike will be catastrophic. Why preempt? Because it might be less catastrophic than to strike second. Plausible and wrong, which we've known totally since 1983, same year we're talking about, which is, by the way, the year of the bishop's pastoral letter on nuclear war, by the way. But among other things, when Sagan and the others, including Russians, first published their findings on nuclear winter, which made it clear that within a year, it wouldn't have made any difference which one went first. Nearly everyone would be gone from the effect, which I won't go into, of smoke lofted into the stratosphere, which would kill all the crops, and it wouldn't kill everybody right away. They would die slowly and horribly, as in India in the 19th century from famine. Not the best way to die. We all know, people our age, there are better and worse ways to die. And starving to death, first watching your children do it, and then the older people, and then your own people, is not actually the best way to die. And the people who, as Herman Kahn used to say, will the living envy the dead? Yeah, why not? The people who are at ground zero will have been lucky. Absolutely, no question about it. So Arkhipov then was readying himself, and thanks to Stanislav Petrov, whom I was in touch with, I asked, got a message through to Stanislav Petrov, how sure were you that it was a false alarm? And the message got back to me through an intermediary, 50-50. And I don't think he meant just, 50-50, something uncertain. I think he, in the context, meant about 50-50. You remember that, like the flip of a coin. One of the things that influenced him was, as you know, that the ground-based radar was not yet confirming what the satellite warning was telling him. So he had one system telling him there was an attack, another system telling him there might not be. He knew that in that period, if he had said truthfully, it's 50-50, Arkhipov, and well, it wouldn't go straight to Arkhipov, but the several levels above him were all cocked and poised. If there's a 50% chance, do it. And to what effect, as I say? It's insane. It had been, this was 1983. Granted, they didn't know about nuclear winter, but as far as the Northern Hemisphere was concerned, Russia, US, West Europe, East Europe, parts of India, annihilated. The Northern Hemisphere, pretty much, even though they didn't know about nuclear winter yet, later that year. Okay, so the US, as Patrick was saying, has been cocked in this way since the beginning of the Strategic Air Command. And that goes before the Russians had a nuclear weapon. It was first strike only. There was no first strike. There would be no second strike. We had a monopoly. And the idea was, ever since, to this day, what is being rehearsed right now? I mean, recently with these two nuclear exercises in Russia and here. Well, in theory, answering an attack. To what effect? Insane. But actually, in practice, if you have some warning, go first. And as Patrick said, that is the danger in this. There's two dangers. One danger is that one tactical weapon goes off, we don't respond. That's fine. I'm glad they're thinking that way. And we do something catastrophic, Biden has promised. We do something catastrophic to a nuclear power that has just used a nuclear weapon. So what do they do to the catastrophic thing that we just answered that with? Give up? Surrender? I don't think that's the mood that leads one to initiate the first nuclear weapon in combat since Nagasaki. So they send another one, or 5 or 6 or 7. What do you do then? And what do you do when there's an exchange of tactical weapons? It could end. That's why Putin is doing it. It could shock people into negotiations that he can't get any other way that would give him terms that he can accept, Putin. And that, as I've known from studying a lot of different conflicts, when a leader in a desperate situation, and this is not just military, but all kinds of things, feels that there is only one way to get out of this. It happens to be a very risky way. It might be disastrous, but it might get you out of this situation. It's the only thing that would. They do it. That's how you get catastrophes. That's how catastrophes happen. That's in my study. I won't give more examples of that. But the current situation then is, yes, it is possible that Putin would do what he's threatening to do. Put me in a situation where I'm losing, and losing what? Losing Russia, losing what used to be called the Donbass, Luhansk and Donetsk, used to be Ukraine, but now it's Russian. So what if I'm about to be using the territorial integrity of Russia? The only way I can stop this, not win, not get you Kiev, he knows he won't get Kiev out of this, but the only way I can get into negotiations where I keep the Donbass and Crimea is to shock these people into fear. And it could work. That's why he might do it. And he thinks that even if it was unrealistic. Then you get in a situation where both sides believe totally falsely that if this thing is going to explode or it's going to escalate, better to go first. It's untrue. It is as untrue as curing COVID with bleach. And yet, both sides are preparing to do that. So here is where we are. If I may just draw something from this on what to do. Obviously, this situation that we have led in creating for the last 70 years is, as Kennedy once put it, intolerable. After the Cuban Missile Crisis, you can't have a rational world with the existence of nuclear weapons, he concluded. And if he'd lived, who knows? If he'd been allowed to live, who knows what might have come of that. We have failed, all of us who've been working our lives on this. And I'm looking at several people who I know personally who've been spending their lives on this. We have failed to get any one of our presidents to say that they will not initiate nuclear war under any circumstances. Now, of course, they've talked about eliminating nuclear weapons, Article 6. Bullshit. That has never entered the mind of our president in my lifetime, and I'm 91. Eliminating nuclear weapons. No first use has been discussed. Obama discussed it. Biden said that he would go for it in his campaign. No, we will not hear that as of now without some kind of change here in the situation from Biden, although he could afford in Europe easily to say it. We were the ones who always said NATO is based on first use, as it still is. But that was because Russia, the Warsaw Pact, and the Soviet Union were believed to have overwhelming power, conventional power. That's totally shifted. The Warsaw Pact, except for Russia, has shifted sides. It's now on NATO. In fact, it's in NATO. And except for Ukraine and Georgia and Moldova. So we don't have to threaten first use. No, we have legitimized for 70 years that a nuclear power with nuclear weapons faced with conventional defeat has a right and expectation of initiating nuclear war. That's been our policy forever. So here's a question. How many nations, is it 120 who or more that have signed the Treaty for Prevention of Nuclear War, saying it is criminal to possess a nuclear weapon, let alone to threaten it? And 60, is it, who've ratified that? No ally of ours, or Russia for that matter, or China, but 60 nations. Why are we hearing from 120 nations that have signed the TPNW, the Treaty for Prevention of Nuclear War, Prohibition of Nuclear Weapons? Putin's current threats are criminal, immoral, insane, catastrophic, absolutely unacceptable. Why aren't we saying it? Well, that answers itself, because we've been making those threats for 70 years. So we're not in a position to say, we were in a position to say, you won't like it. It'll be, quote, very, very serious. In fact, it'll be catastrophic. Exactly what he has in mind there is not too clear. Let's say a huge conventional attack on Russia, which Russia's supposed to accept without going for. Okay, so we're not saying it. Why isn't the rest of the world saying that? Our allies, well, they're demanding first use. It's come up just recently. They say, no, you can't say no first use. Our whole defense is based on this. And then Poland and the Baltics and so forth. Yeah, we really have a problem. We want to have the same assurance that Berlin had. And that worked for West Berlin, which it did actually, at the cost of building 2 doomsday machines, which is where we are now. Each on a hair trigger, each ready to preempt. We did succeed in keeping Russians from walking into West Berlin. But this was the price, to assure that we're not only making first use threats, but we will back them up by a willingness to preempt if necessary. So that's how you get it. Okay, I just come back to the point. Who is it? It isn't Putin. It didn't start with Putin. Who is it who has normalized the idea of nuclear first use threats to the fact that we're not hearing from hardly anybody in the UN who has signed that treaty? That this is intolerable and it's criminal and you can't do it. Okay, let me finish up with this thought. How I do it. Eliminating nuclear weapons is essential for our survival. It is not going to happen this year. It's not going to happen next winter, and it's not going to happen the next year. During which, day by day, we are facing the risks that Patrick Mazza laid out and Arjun laid out for me. Arjun has been not only a friend for these many years, but a mentor and the first person to add to the list of nuclear first use threats that I put out. I was following Dick Barnett, Sidney Lenz, and others were talking about nuclear threats. I made a list of them. Arjun was the first person to add to that list. And then Joe Gerson added some more, and some other people. It's risen to several dozen now, first use threats by the US. Biden is not going to say first use, though he's not talking about it at this moment. He's not going to say no first use now, because he's relying on that to keep the Chinese out of Taiwan, who we used to have conventional superiority there until 20 years ago, when we used it under Clinton and sent carriers into the Taiwan Straits. They built up conventionally. Now they have conventional superiority. Who will be making first use threats if there's a conflict over Taiwan? Biden is not going to give that up. He would be accused by both parties. The Democrats are being as hawkish on China and Taiwan and Ukraine, more hawkish than the Republicans on Ukraine, and as hawkish on China. All of them. Ro Khanna, Ed Markey, everyone, Nancy Pelosi, obviously, but all the progressives are saying, got to defend Taiwan to the, and how are you going to do that? By giving up your first use threat that you've been making all these years? I don't think so. But how about the rest of us? We don't have to go along with that. The progressives who backed away from the talk of negotiation and ceasefire this last week, my God, it's really an ominous situation. These people, Ro Khanna, Ilhan Omar, the others, couldn't do it. Couldn't keep up with it. Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez can't manage to talk about negotiation or concession in this situation. We're in a very dangerous situation. And if we keep trying to win as Zelensky and Biden and everybody else, Boris Johnson earlier, everybody has said we've got to do, thrust every Russian out of the Donbass and out of Crimea, we might get close to doing that. And what could be more dangerous? So at least we can say, we can start telling the truth about this situation. And here's a truth that I have never said. I haven't allowed myself to think. It's just this. Reagan talked in 1983, 1 and 2 and 3, about evil empires. And he was talking about Russia, Soviet Union. Every empire does evil. Every empire does evil. The US is not exceptional in that respect. Look at the first few threats we've been making. Look at what Biden is doing right now in Yemen. And the genocidal attacks for which we are supporting day by day. We don't see the photographs, but they're happening. All right, in Russia. My country, the United States of America, is an evil-doing empire. It's an evil-doing empire, and it's been that for a long time. And Russia, as Jackie was saying so very well earlier today, of course, the same is true of the aggression and the massacres that are being done in Ukraine right now. And in effect, we've got two assholes who are holding the entire world hostage at this moment. And for their own staying in office, their own Zelensky, I'm sure if he changed his tune right now, he would be killed, probably. So he's really on the spot. He's not just going to lose his job, which he would if he talks about concessions. I'm pretty sure he thinks he would be killed. Well, you could say, well, all right, shouldn't he be willing to risk that under these circumstances? And the answer is, and who would replace him? Somebody, and so forth. Who will replace Putin? Somebody better. So it's possible to say it is outrageous, and it has always been outrageous. And many of us here have been saying this, as Jackie points out, for decades and generations. What we have done for half a century and more is outrageous, criminal, immoral, insane. And what the others are doing, what Russia is doing right now, is the same. The other states, all but China, I'll give you a little secret, all but China say first use. And here's a little secret I learned about 20 years ago. China excludes Taiwan from its no first use policy. That's an internal matter. That's part of China. I was told this by a Chinese high-level guy. No. Taiwan, we might use nuclear weapons first. Wonderful. Anyway, the time has come. We cannot wait for the elimination of nuclear weapons to say what you are threatening and preparing to do is absolutely outrageous, criminal, and wrong. And all we can do is say it. Last Arjun held up a thing about the Indian famine in the 19th century, one of the many. I was reading about that today because, of course, there's a book named by Mike Davis called Late Victorian Holocausts. And I'm sure he mentioned that particular famine as part of it.
The pictures are from his book.
He died the night before yesterday. He's been in palliative care for cancer for years, actually. But 4 or 5 months ago, he was told you have 6 months to live. That ended the night before last. And practically his last words, the last words of the last interview that Mike Davis gave, which I saw because of his death, obituaries just today, were, despair is useless. Now, you can't argue with that. Despair is useless. Nothing else may work. Nothing else. But he says you fight against what's wrong, you tell the truth, when you can, and love each other. And that's what we have to do. None of us, I don't know who else can, but I can certainly say I have never felt I have done everything I could to avoid this moment, or that I've done enough to do it. I've never felt that. And of course, right now, what can one say? But it is true, despair is useless, and the miracle you can put off these Holocaust and this new era of limited nuclear war that may precede the ultimate final. If he uses a nuclear weapon, I'll tell you, I believe Putin, I believe probably won't blow the world up. We're too poised against that. I mean, at the top, they know about that. But it will almost inevitably lead to an era of proliferation where other people say, now these things, you can actually carry out the threats. So now we can make more threats. Putin's, whatever happens, Russia's threats of its 1,000 nuclear weapons or 400 or whatever they have operational are now more potent than they ever were before. US also make the threats, deter the threats, need the weapons, and we'll have a world in which there isn't just the Hiroshima here or there. The Hiroshimas happen, around. That's the new face of war. And that's bad enough. And then the preemption happens. So let's tell the truth. And we have heard some remarkable truths today. I want to read them all. And I thank you all for being at it. They're at it, so we've got to be at it and keep at it. And this has been a wonderful session.
Thank you, Dan. The photographs are from Mike Davis's book, Such Sad News. He permitted me to use them. The photographs I showed are from Mike Davis's book.
Was that from his book?
Yeah, he permitted me to use them.
Yeah.
Thank you, Dan, very much. So the Hibakusha say that and they believe this, that if nuclear weapons are ever used again in war, that they will be impossible to contain. And Dan, you know a lot more than I do about this, but I know a little bit, and I know that there have been a number of war games over the years, and especially in the last, say, 10 years, 15 years, and to my knowledge, virtually every war game that's been planned out where nuclear weapons are used, it has escalated to more or less an all-out war. So I think that that if any expectation that the use of nuclear weapons in war can be contained it's not realistic, and that the goal needs to be more than the goal. The demand needs to be the abolishment of nuclear weapons, because statistically speaking, as long as they're there, they will be used.
What demand should we make, if I may say, to reduce the risks this month and next month? And they really have been hearing eliminate nuclear weapons. Remember, that was resolution number 1.
Number 1, United Nations. That's right.
One.
Right at the very, going all the way back. Yeah.
Well, that was 77 years ago.
Yeah.
And when it comes now, I think, yes, of course, say eliminate nuclear weapons. Yes, absolutely. And meanwhile, before they're eliminated, I think we have to absolutely delegitimize what is just possible. Eliminating them, I'm saying, nearly everything I do is try to do is impossible. But there are levels of impossibility. And eliminating the nuclear weapons is not going to happen before Christmas. That's not coming any more than Santa Claus is coming. No first use is very unlikely also. But at least we can say right now, what you are saying and doing right now is absolutely unacceptable. And one last, I'm sorry, I keep saying that, I know. I had to go off the screen here right when we first started without expecting, because I got a phone call from Daniel Hale in Marion Prison. And he's there for 44 months. I was asking him, we had 15 minutes as usual, and he calls me about every week. And I said, how much more do you have to go? And he said, 20 months. He said, I'll get out just before the election. I said, well, I hope, we'll have a world here. We probably will. We may well have used nuclear weapons before that time. I do think that's a real possibility. Somebody said here, Arjun, was it? What's the risk of nuclear war? No, I think it was Patrick. Who knows? Right. Who knows? Good point. It's not zero. We know that. But putting it off is not zero either. And Daniel Hale is, you all know, the guy who revealed the atrocity producing process of our drone situation. He's spending 40 months in prison as a result of that, of revealing that. But I urge you all, if you want to feel hope, read Daniel Hale's statement to the judge at sentencing in 2019, if you haven't read it. Probably most of you have. It will give you hope, because here's what I said to Daniel. I said, Daniel, I've been telling everybody to read that statement of yours for the sentencing. I said, my basis for hope is that you exist. And other people, not enough, and not even a lot, proportionally to the world, like you, exist. That's our hope. And it's not a vain hope. It's possible. It's not impossible. Nuclear war is not impossible, and averting it is not impossible. That's where we are.
Okay, thank you, Daniel. So, we're coming up on the time when we said we were going to end the program, but I don't want to cut everybody off. So let's plan to run about 15 minutes over, which gives us another 20 minutes. But before I open it up, I'd like Dennis Nelson to say a few words. Dennis has been a member of our committee for many years. He and his wife Denise have devoted their lives to supporting radiation survivors worldwide. And I referred earlier to Rosalie Bertell. She wrote a book called No Immediate Danger, and I think she talked about 10 to 20 million victims worldwide. Many of them were indigenous, the people in Algeria and Marshall Islands and Tahiti and the Aboriginals in Australia. Regarding the weapons testing, the downwinders like Dennis's hometown of St. George, Utah, Cedar City, Utah, the Kazakhs, and on and on and on and on and on. And we need to remember those victims when we're talking about, the threat of nuclear war for Arjun and the Hibakusha around the world. It's not a threat. It's a daily reality. So, Arjun, would you say a few words? Then what we'll do in about 3 or 4 minutes, we're going to open it up to some short comments or questions, but we're only going to take about 15 minutes. So, Dennis, could you say a few words to the group?
Thank you, John. As you mentioned, I did grow up in St. George, Utah. I was born in 1943, and so I was 7 years old in 1951 when the first fallout clouds came over my hometown. Later, I found out that they were directed that direction because we were a low-use segment of the population, and they didn't really want to irradiate people in Las Vegas or Los Angeles or other major population centers. There were only about 4,500 people in my hometown, and over the many years or several years that they were testing in Nevada, I was able to see the flashes over my hometown. The mountains to the west would light up like a flashbulb, even though it was 100 and maybe 110, 120 miles away. The fallout came over our town repeatedly, and it had some major effects. And later on, when I examined the archives and read up about the things that had been declassified, I realized that they knew all about the effect of radiation. They knew that it was going to cause an effect, but it was not going to be immediate. It was going to take a while for it to actually show up. And so they figured they could get away with it if they just kept it secret. And so they actually committed fraud on the court. When the sheep died, the court actually found in favor of not the sheep. When the sheep died, the court actually found that there was no effect because the government had actually conspired to keep hidden crucial data from the Hanford site where they had used artificial fallout on sheep. And this artificial fallout that had come from reactors at the Hanford site had exactly the same effects that these sheep had from the bombs. So the two principals in that case were Warren Berger, who was a employee in the civil division of the Justice Department, and Richard Nixon, who was then vice president. Those two conspired to hide these reports from the court, so the court wasn't able to see them, so they couldn't show that the radiation was actually the cause of these symptoms. And thousands of these sheep died, many of them just after birth. So that was the first instance of the U.S. Lying about the effects of fallout on the populations and the environment. Then over the years, my parents, there were 7 of us in the family. My parents died. 2 of my siblings died, all of cancer, 7 different kinds of cancer, nothing consistent, but it was all cancer, and it was all as a result of the fallout. In fact, just 2 years ago, I was diagnosed with lymphoma, and you can see the depression in my forehead where the lymphoma, which originated in my sinus, actually grew through my skull and out into my forehead. And that was actually treated with chemotherapy and immunotherapy. And I'm still alive at age 79. But I lost a father at 62, a mother at 47, a sister at 40, and a brother at 49, all of cancer, and all an average of 53 years of age at death. So that's what really happens when you have bombs tested in the atmosphere, which a nuclear war would do, which spreads all over, and there's no containing it. The government officials even said, when asked who's responsible for protecting us against your fallout, and they said, oh, there's nothing to worry about. And besides, it's the responsibility of the head of household to protect his family from fallout. So the government was disingenuous. They lied. They killed their own, and it was politicians who thought that they knew better, that 70 years worth of nuclear deterrence was worth the loss of a few thousand, 10,000, 100,000 people. Unfortunately, the siting of the test site impacted my family disproportionately, but it impacted the entire United States. And there have been, I think, millions of deaths, premature deaths in the United States from radiation due to that testing in Nevada. So that's my story, and I'm sticking to it.
Yeah, thank you, Dennis. Thank you very much. So we're going to open it up for questions. We got about another 15 minutes. So questions and comments. Stephen has his hand up. Unmute.
Well, thank you. It's Stephen Sondheim. I'm so enjoyed this, especially everybody, including Daniel. I'm started to propose in a chat, and I wasn't finished. I'm thinking of a negotiated settlement that's win-win. And I'm thinking when you back somebody into a corner like Putin or even like Zelensky, they're not going to give in. But what I'm thinking is that Putin needs a way out where he can save face. And one of the ways out would be a negotiated settlement where the people in Ukraine, the quote Russian people, who I think have been bothered or persecuted, are given essential rights and protections in a way that makes Putin look good, like he got something, he got assurances, but also allows Ukraine to keep its territories. And something like that could be negotiated by, I'll stop in a minute, by a third party with no stakes and possibly could be reinforced by the UN. I'm looking for a way that makes Putin feel like he has a way out and doesn't ask Ukraine to give up territory. Just a suggestion. Okay, thank you. Thank you.
Dot, you're next.
Yeah, I have a question for Dan Ellsberg. So what would improve our chances of surviving until Christmas or the next few months? Right now, the US is maintaining a policy of strategic ambiguity. In other words, keep Putin guessing as to what the US reaction would be should Putin use a nuclear weapon. If let's propose an alternative. If the US were to say right now that if Russia uses a nuclear weapon, the US will not respond tit for tat, will not respond with a nuclear weapon. Which of these two options would deter or lower the risk of Putin using a nuclear weapon?
You were asking me, I'm sorry.
Yes, that's a question for Dan. Yeah.
Okay, I have to admit, as you may have guessed here, I'm not hearing too well, and I missed quite a bit of that. But I think let me address that briefly, at least what I did hear, if I may. As I said, well, I think it's extremely undesirable for Putin to use that nuclear weapon, even though I do not, John and I are having this little argument here. I don't think the odds are anything like certain or nearly certain that would blow up the world. But at best, it would be a new era. And there's a good sizable possibility, yes, that it would escalate all the way. Just not a certainty, I think. But that would be a world we don't want to be in. And I think that the 30 or so people in Congress who tentatively suggested that we should be exploring negotiations with this aggressor, murderous aggressor, Putin, as we were in Iraq. It would be, remember the role that Biden played on the Senate Foreign Relations Committee to get us into Iraq by removing witnesses from the hearings then that were opposed to the war at that point. Actually, we haven't killed nearly, they haven't killed nearly as many people in Ukraine yet as in Iraq so far. And that was as much aggression as this, both criminal aggression. So the two criminal aggressors, I think, should be talking and exploring how to get to stop as quickly as possible Russians from shooting at Ukrainians with, now, let me admit, by the way, a real uncertainty here. Today, tomorrow, this week. Do you really, just to say, I've been chewing on this, do you really tell the Ukrainians who may be taking Kherson finally to stop even before they take Kherson, which may be taken? That's a really hard one. But it's not going to happen within a day or so anyway. So we'll know how that, whether it's a stalemate or a Ukrainian victory in Kherson within a week, I would guess, pretty much. But in terms of a ceasefire, how can you suggest, and Zelensky cannot afford with his life to suggest this, that you go back to pre-February 24th of this year? Go back to the situation that existed then before. How can you suggest there's been aggression, there's been and the answer is because it isn't just Ukrainians and it isn't just Americans and it isn't just Russians who are threatened at this point. The entire world interest, not every human, 98% probably, according to Ellen Roebuck and others, not everybody dies in nuclear winter. Some people live in New Zealand on mollusks and seafood, and at the shore of Australia. But over 5 billion die, like as in India, except for the lucky ones who are vaporized immediately. For their sake, you don't pursue the degree of humiliation that would be involved in trying to thrust every Russian out of Crimea and out of the Donbass. And the Ukrainians may feel, no, we're on the way. Sorry about that, but that is a recipe not just for endless war, but for likely escalation. And that is not tolerable to the world. So all I'm saying is what they said about pursuing ceasefire and negotiations, which will involve concessions, and finding out what concessions will end this, is a demand we should be making. And if I think that answers your question. On the good side, today I saw for the first time in my lifetime, or since 45, the following words in the New York Times: no one in the administration is for replying to a nuclear weapon with a nuclear response. Now, they've hinted at that for the last day or two. Pardon me, but that has never been said in 50 years by practically anybody in any situation. They hit you with a nuclear weapon, you don't respond with a nuclear weapon. Okay, there is a degree of sanity, which both sides have been showing up to some extent. Putin has not attacked the transportation sites in Poland, Romania, and elsewhere that, as he said, are legitimate targets if in pursuit of aggression, right? Which he doesn't regard as aggression. Okay, and Biden has resolutely not said what Hillary Clinton asked him to do, a no-fly zone that would mean shooting down Russian planes. He has not said what Zelensky has asked him to do in terms of similar terms of involving NATO directly and sending troops. So they're both showing a degree of prudence so far. Let them act on that and get this and get the ceasefire now and get negotiations. That's what I'm saying. Before there's a nuclear weapon, and then the same. If there is a nuclear weapon and we fail to do that, again, ceasefire negotiations. It doesn't mean surrendering Kiev or Moscow or Washington. It does mean ending as quickly as possible a current process which is heading us, has much risk of nuclear war, as in 1983 or 1962. That's what we need to try to end. I honestly don't know, because of my hearing problem, whether I've answered your question, but it's in the same ballpark.
Yeah,